Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the BaseCAMP webinar. And we're pleased to welcome Tom Jordan from the University of Wisconsin and Sara Borland from the University of Nebraska to talk a little bit about BaseCAMP today. But before they get started, I'd like to give you, well, first of all, we're taking questions by the chat function in Zoom. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says chat that you need to click in order to see the chat. And then the default is to send a message to panelists. So please select on that drop-down menu to send it to, I can't remember what it exactly says. It says to everyone or to panelists and attendees, something like that, so that everybody can see your question, and then we can present that to the speakers and they'll answer your questions. Okay, so to get started, BaseCAMP was something that we started in this iteration anyway last year, and as you know, we've had to change it to a virtual meeting this year. But the intent of BaseCAMP is to provide people with an introduction to identity management and an introduction to the federation and federated identity management. BaseCAMP also will include an overview of the services and software that are part of the InCommon Trusted Access Platform, and those main components are Shibboleth, Grouper, Co-Manage, and Midpoint. And this is not training for the software. This is very much an overview of the software, and there'll be a little demo of each of those during BaseCAMP, but as I said, it's not training. And then all the BaseCAMP sessions will be recorded. If you come to BaseCAMP, you'll have access to those for a period of time after the meeting to go back and refer to. And then you can see the link on the screen here. And when I'm finished talking, I'll put that in the chat so it's clickable. And that web page has a link to the program, gives you an overview of BaseCAMP, and also a link to the registration page. I just went over this stuff, so I don't have to do it again. I think the only one I didn't mention is that if you're looking to somehow retool or rework your IAM systems, and we know some people are, in part because of budget constraints now. And if you're looking at that and in part looking at open source solutions, BaseCAMP is a good place to come to learn about the Trusted Access Platform. In general, each day of BaseCAMP will have a theme. So the first day we'll do an introduction to identity access management, and Tom will get into that in a couple of minutes. The second day is an introduction to the InCommon Federation and also how you use the Federation. We'll do a demo of the Federation Manager, which is the portal that people can use to make changes and to interact with other organizations within the Federation. And then Wednesday and Thursday we'll have, those are the days that we'll have the introduction to the software. There'll be 2 tracks each of those days. A 101 track will just talk about concepts, and then the 201 track is where we'll do the quick demos and get into a little bit more of the details. The nice thing about doing this virtually is all this stuff will be recorded. So if you go to the 101 track and then you want to come back later and see what went on in the other track, you'll have access to those recordings. And then the final day on Friday is when we'll talk about how to develop project plans. We'll talk about DevOps and that approach a little bit, and then a speaker who will talk about how they move their IAM infrastructure into the cloud. So each of these days will be a half day. It's noon to 4 o'clock Eastern time. And as I said, it starts on Monday and it'll be half days all day or all week on the week of July 20th. So having said all that, I'll turn it over to Tom Jordan. Tom?
Thanks, Dean. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Tom Jordan from the University of Wisconsin, and I wanted to just welcome everybody from the Badger State. We in Wisconsin have been engaged in the higher education identity and access management community through InCommon for many, many years. And one of the really interesting things and neat things that I like about BaseCAMP is that we get to talk not just about technology, but also about the community and the power of community in running our programs and understanding, the things that are different in higher education identity and access management, to be able to connect with our peers, learn who they are, and find common solutions to common problems. So as we introduce new technologies and things like that in BaseCAMP, we also introduce a lot about the idea of community. Next slide, please, Dean. So a little bit about myself. I will be teaching the Introduction to Identity and Access Management topic on the first day. I've got, my current role is as an integration architect at UW-Madison. Most of my background is in identity and access management, but I now work more broadly with data architecture and things like that. I worked as the reference architecture lead for Internet 2's tier initiative, what has since become the Trusted Access Platform. And through that work, worked with the entity registries and data structures working groups. This year, I am the chair of the CACTI group, the Community Architecture Council for Trust and Identity. And as I mentioned, my colleagues and I at Madison have been a part of the higher education IM community for quite some time. So let's take a look at what we're going to be looking at in the Identity Management Basics course. I would like to call your attention to the center of this diagram, which brings forward a theme that you'll hear a lot at BaseCAMP around the different components that go into a successful identity and access management program. And we break them broadly into the idea of identity registration, grouping, provisioning, and authentication and federation. Identity registration, or the establishment of a person registry, really deals with how we go about bringing person or identity information into our identity ecosystem. And in this session, we'll talk about different strategies for doing that. Grouping and authorization really figures out how to build cohorts of people to be able to grant access to services, manage access to services, remove access when appropriate, audit, things like that. Provisioning is a part of the infrastructure that ensures that we can interface with IT services and make those services available to users based on our authorization logic. And authentication and federation deals with things like login, cross-campus login, multi-factor, things like that, to be able to establish a sense of identity in an online transaction. You can see on either side of this diagram things like institutional systems of record, campus and external service providers. And these are really the components that we're connecting our identity management infrastructure and practices to be able to facilitate integration with data and making services available to our end users. So let's move on to the next slide and dip into one of these boxes a little bit. This is a sneak peek of some of the discussion around identity registries as we explore that area of the IT or of the identity and access management infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit about one thing that identity registries usually do, and that's person matching, which often involves deduplication. There are several strategies for this. Demographic data comparison can be used to look at components of a person's name, maybe a date of birth, a gender, a national identifier, things like that, but are highly dependent upon things like data quality, data provenance, and increasingly become more and more difficult to manage in areas where privacy becomes a concern. Demographic data comparison involves asking a lot of our users, asking them to share a lot of information. And in transactions or relationships where there is less of an institutional affiliation or intimacy with the user, it becomes more and more objectionable to ask for sufficient information to be able to do demographic-based data comparison. So continuity-based identity matching is a strategy that one can use in those situations. Some refer to this as identity first, or bring your own bring your own identity. You might think of social login like Facebook or Twitter or things like that, where what we're really looking for in identity matching and deduplication is to see the user authenticate multiple times across different sessions. And this is a technique that can be used to deal with those situations where we can't collect sufficient demographic information to do demographic comparison matching. We'll also talk about things like duplicate detection and remediation. I see a question in the chat around data deduplication being done after account creation. Certainly that's a thing that we will talk about. What I've seen some campuses do in that regard is to have a process by which they can mark, records that they suspect to be duplicates with others before provisioning happens, or to wait for provisioning systems that are difficult to deduplicate. A portal that just provides dynamic content can maybe be adjusted after an account is merged, but a different system like an email system where there are mailboxes and original content that needs to be resolved can be more difficult. So there might be different strategies related to those things. So that's a sneak peek about a little bit of what we'll talk about with identity registries. Let's move on to the next topic and talk about provisioning and deprovisioning. There are several different approaches to provisioning and deprovisioning, including just-in-time provisioning, which is a strategy that allows users to be provisioned to an application only when the user is seeking to use that application, usually through things like SAML login or OAuth, and with attribute delivery to be able to create the user record. This has some distinct advantages in that it minimizes the data footprint that's sent to an application. It oftentimes helps with things like right-sizing licensing, so that you're only licensing the number of users that actually want to use a service rather than the users that would be eligible to use a service. It creates a much looser coupling between the application and the infrastructure. So you don't have to keep pace between those two applications with things like upgrade cycles and versions and things like that. However, it also has some downsides. It can be challenging to grant permissions to a user before they've logged in for the first time. Those of you that might have done federation with Confluence products are probably used to the idea that in order to give somebody access to a Jira board or things like that, you need them to log in at least once so that they have a user record in the system. They can also be challenging with regards to auditing as well, because you may have a user record for a user that can no longer log into the service. The login process would not allow them to access it successfully in the future, but because of the loose coupling, you might not know that that user is no longer eligible for the service if they don't actually log in and try to use it. So in situations where audits require kind of a positive confirmation that all users that are not eligible have been removed from the system, just-in-time provisioning can be challenging. What's often done to accommodate that in just-in-time provisioning systems is to use an idle timeout deprovisioning strategy, where we take users that haven't logged in for a certain amount of time and either mark them as inactive or remove them from the system. But we'll talk in the session about different provisioning and deprovisioning strategies that can be used within different applications, what their advantages and disadvantages are, and when we might use each one. Next slide, please. There are a number of other topics that we'll cover in this session, including things like person data aggregation, grouping, social and external login, role-based and attribute-based access control. But it's not really all about technology. We want to do a fairly high-level overview of these various things. But one of the most important things that we do in BaseCAMP is to help orient folks to the higher education identity and access management community landscape, to be able to understand what organizations are out there to be able to help folks be successful in their identity and access management journey. One thing that I like to do in this session is also to help folks understand the different architectural styles of identity and access management and how they sometimes relate to organizational structures. Following Conway's law that, technical systems often mirror the organizational structures that they exist in. While working with the community, we've found that, centralized IT organizations may have slightly different identity and access management approaches than decentralized. And some of those, some of those things are interesting to note. And with that, I will turn it over to Sara to talk a little bit about the experience of a first timer coming to BaseCAMP.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Borland from the University of Nebraska. I'm an identity and access management analyst, and I began my first day on this job literally flying out to Milwaukee for BaseCAMP 2019. I had previously been working in our help desk here at UNL for the past 4 years prior to this position. So I had experience with account provisioning, deprovisioning, password resets, renaming accounts, supporting multi-factor authentication. We use Duo here, single sign-on, and a little bit of grouper experience. But overall, I felt I was going into BaseCamp pretty blind and very much a newbie. As far as my expectations and what I was hoping to learn, I knew that BaseCamp was geared for those new to identity, but I didn't really think that that meant first day on the job. So I definitely crammed the itinerary quickly. I reached out to my boss to give me input on which tracks and sessions to attend because I was very unsure going into it. But I know the first day we touched on federation basics and we were separated out into groups of either the identity provider or the service providers. And to be honest, I didn't know what the difference was until my boss explained it. So I was definitely appreciative for his clarification prior to me leaving. Overall, I was definitely open to learning, but I went into it thinking I didn't know enough yet to even be there. So those fears of the unknown were quickly put to rest. The camp counselors were amazing and welcoming right from the start. Shout out to Kevin, who broke the ice and got everyone engaged every morning. Just a side note, his humor alone will definitely bring you in. So, but the camp counselors were more than happy to answer our questions and also were happy to share their stories of their journeys into identity. Because honestly, no one is born knowing all of this information. I was surprised walking into the ballroom on the first day of BaseCamp and to see that almost half of the room were women. Most of my years spent in IT, I was one of few women in the department and usually always the only woman in the room. So I was very happy to see that. I'm used to it after all these years, but was pleasantly surprised. So there are definitely women in identity. As far as what I learned in BaseCamp 2019, I got a great overview of federation, onboarding, and account lifecycle, managing access, which for us in higher ed know that can sometimes get really interesting when the users aren't current faculty, staff, or students. So those guest accounts and maneuvering roles. I learned more about shibboleth and grouper, but even more important than the terms and concepts, I was able to build relationships with others that understand this world of identity. To be a part of a community is a great feeling, and meeting others who work in this field was wonderful. Being able to talk the talk with others in higher ed about the issues that they face was refreshing, and I made some wonderful friends and contacts that I can reach out to at any time to ask questions. To be honest, I walked away each day with complete brain overload. No lie. But by the end of it, I was exhausted and I wasn't even sure what I had just learned by the end of BaseCamp. But however, after this last year, I've been able to put many of those puzzle pieces together. I've gotten my hands in many areas that were discussed in last year's BaseCamp. I now have much more experience as I help onboard new services and work with service providers. I definitely know firsthand how it is a much smoother process onboarding a service provider that's a member of InCommon versus those that are not. So much time wasted and back and forth, and it's definitely a benefit I've seen firsthand. I work with Grouper a lot, from access policies to term rollover to reports. We use Grouper for many things. As far as what I wish was different, what I would have changed from last year, I was hoping for more hands-on opportunities to really see everything in action. And as you see, I am part of the BaseCamp 2020 Planning Committee. So this year you will see more demos and overviews of what's behind the curtains. What I truly think will be valuable, though, is the fact that you get recordings to be able to go back and watch. I would have loved to been able to see all the tracks that I wasn't able to see. So going to the 101, but then watching the recording of the 201 will be really helpful. So that's a huge resource, and I wish we did have it last year. To be able to refer back to that info is awesome. I do just want to take this opportunity to thank the planning committee. They've been so thoughtful and truly wanting feedback from last year and to make this year's BaseCamp the best that it can be. As Dean said, we thought this was going to be an in-person event initially, and they listened and tweaked, and then COVID happened and we had to change to the virtual session. And again, more than ever, the committee were extremely dedicated and detailed in wanting to create sessions and provide beneficial content for attendees. So thank you for investing in us newbies and caring enough to provide a training opportunity like this, which honestly I've never seen in any other thing I've attended for IT. So thank you. For those of you who are new, please don't feel like you need to know everything to attend BaseCamp. I was a bit overwhelmed feeling that I needed to know everything before I got there, or even that I needed to understand it all by the end of BaseCamp. And I think Ann West and Jessica Fink both assured me while I was going through it, it's going to take some time to digest. So don't be too hard on yourself, and it may not make sense right away, but it will eventually. And at times it definitely felt like I was being served a full course meal when I was really only ready for baby food. It may have taken me some time to digest, but I'm now applying what I learned. And I really can't wait to attend this year to see how much I've grown. Again, this community is so welcoming and happy to answer any questions you might have. There is definitely a wealth of knowledge at your fingertips, so take advantage of it. They are more than happy to share the knowledge with you. This planning committee took the feedback from last year to heart, and BaseCamp 2020 will truly be an amazing learning experience for everyone that attends, and I'm extremely excited to see you all there. So, Dean, back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, Tom, too. And we have plenty of time for questions. If anyone has any questions about of course, Tom was giving you kind of just a snippet of what you'll learn the first day of BaseCamp with his session, his 2-hour session on Introduction to Identity and Access Management. If you have questions about anything Tom or Sarah talked about, or if you have any questions about what else the program includes, we'd be happy to go through some of that now. So I'll just give you a minute. If you have any, type them into the chat, please. I think that there's one there for you, Tom.
Yeah, that's so the question is, the recommended practice in authorizing access to services based on a federated login and the value and EduPerson scoped affiliation. Let me tell you about the grouper deployment guide. That's a thing that we'll talk a little bit about. One thing that we talk a lot about in BaseCamp is the fact that there's no one way to do things, right? And necessarily so, because all software is not created equal. And you have hundreds, if not thousands, of different vended systems that you're going to have to interface with as an integration expert. There are certainly situations where we would like to be able to do federated login and deliver an EduPerson scoped affiliation attribute, or a member of attribute, or an EduPerson primary affiliation attribute, or things like that. These really are all tools, different tools that we have in our toolbox. And when we take on an integration project, oftentimes part of the challenge is to figure out, how does this vendor do it? And what different supported mechanisms can I use to be able to answer this question? There are oftentimes, back to specifically to Matthew's question around authorizing based on federated login and EduPerson affiliation, one scenario that we often see is, say, a cloud vendor that doesn't do authorization at all and assumes that anybody that can log in must be eligible to be able to use the service. So I've certainly seen situations where we've used that you know, something like EduPerson scoped affiliation with federated login and even in group membership, perhaps, to be able to stop login at the IDP before the session actually reaches the vendor. It's a mechanism for layering access control into a system that doesn't necessarily support it, into a vended system that doesn't support it. Next question about mixing InCommon and proprietary tools, using Azure as an IDP, but wanting to use Grouper for grouping functioning. One of the primary tenets that we had during the tier project was around the idea that each of these components should be deployable in part or in whole, that campuses will absolutely have existing infrastructure and may have other, you know, other solutions for different parts of the architecture. There is certainly a trusted access platform out there where it supports many of the needs that are unique to higher education. You may choose to deploy all of it. You may choose to deploy some of it. You may choose to deploy none of it, but we'll still love you. And we'll still consider you to be, you know, part of our identity and access management family in higher education. So we certainly see all the time blending of open source and commercial solutions to be able to meet the needs of campuses.
Are there any other questions? There's a question, it looks like this just came to panelists, so I'll read it. I understand all of BaseCamp will be online this year, not in person. What role will camp counselors play? How will participants be able to interact with them? Well, our intent, our plan is that the counselors, so the counselors are our faculty people, right? So they will lead sessions, and we'll have Zoom, we have Zoom integrated with Canvas. And we'll use Zoom, we'll use the chat function, but also we will set it up so that it's not as in this webinar format where you can't unmute yourself. So it will be interactive, and there will be the ability to ask questions and have discussions verbally, as well as some people are comfortable doing in the chat, and we'll do that as well. And then at the end of the day, each day, at least each of the first 4 days, we're going to have what we're calling campfires, which will be a 30-minute session at the end of the day to discuss, and we'll break into small groups of 6 or 7 people per group. And it'll be a time when we can discuss any issues or questions that came up during the day that did not get answered, or any other sort of identity access management issues that you thought about during the day that you don't see kind of coming up in the agenda later in the week. And so we'll staff each one of those campfires with either an Internet 2 staff member like Paul Caskey or Chris Hubing, who are well-versed in all of this stuff, or it will be staffed by people like Sara and Tom and other camp counselors who either can answer the question or know where to go to find the answers to those questions. So we very much, even though there will be presentations and it will be online, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that it's interactive and that it's not just one person talking to many, right? That it's a discussion.
And I'll mention too that if there are requests, like you want to talk to a specific counselor, you can reach out to them, or we can facilitate some other conversations, some side conversations in the campfire rooms. And there's some other ways to do this. So if you guys have ideas when you're at BaseCamp, you know, just let us know, and we'll try to connect you to the right folks.
I see a question from Angelo about staff from a service provider benefit from learning the other side of SHIB integrations. We strongly encourage participation from service providers in BaseCamp. One of the things that will help you understand is some of the considerations that higher education identity practitioners face that might be unique to higher education. and how products can be adapted to be able to make them more friendly and more easily deployable in a higher education setting. As just a simple example, I sometimes chuckle when I talk to private sector folks and explain that there are very few businesses that would turn over a third of their workforce several times a year. But we do that routinely in higher education every time we go through a semester or term changeover. Provisioning and deprovisioning strategies for dealing with those things are super important to higher education folks, and products that adapt well to things like dynamic access control and just-in-time provisioning, you know, they fit a lot better in higher education oftentimes. So the more you can understand that, the more you'll probably be positioned to provide products that are friendly and useful to those of us in higher ed.
And the next question I see is, what's the virtual format for the conference? And the virtual format first is that we'll be using Canvas. In fact, what you're looking at right now is the Canvas front page for BaseCamp 2020. And we'll have the Zoom integrated, so I can actually go through this. And if we click on Monday, we have all of the sessions listed for Monday, and these will be replaced with actual pictures of people. So a little session description and then how to get to the room. So if I want to go to the initial session, then I click on that and I get to the Zoom room that we'll be using for that specific session. Our intent is to, let me go back to the BaseCamp page here. Our intent is to try to keep everything as much as possible either in Zoom or in Canvas, so that we're not, you know, we had talked, for example, about should we use Slack for some things. We want to try to keep everything right here in Canvas so that it's as easy as possible for people to use.
And I'll mention that, so for just general chat, we're planning to use the Canvas chat. So there'll be a link down there at the bottom and on the sidebar. And then when you're in a session, we'll likely, the session folks doing that will have their chat enabled, so you can use that chat for the specific session itself. But for general navigation, where's this, things about the conference, we're going to go ahead and utilize the Canvas chat to keep you again, like Dean said, within Canvas.
And then the next question about receiving details for accessing and logging into BaseCamp. Funny you should mention that, because I just drafted a note this morning that will be going out on Monday to everybody who has registered so far. And it will have some of those details. I think the access actually to Canvas, that we're aiming at July 1st for people to have access to that, so that you want to get used to the interface if you're not used to it. B, if there are some, we expect some of the counselors to provide some sort of read ahead materials, and we'll post those also in Canvas. So the intent is to have that opened up and available on by July 1st. Give another minute here to see if any other questions. Okay, well, not seeing any, I think, oh, I'm too new to know what to ask. Well, then you need to come to BaseCamp. I would encourage you, I know Jessica a couple of minutes ago posted in the chat the link to the program, and I encourage you to go and look at that program, the complete program day by day, so you can see more details on what will be presented and what our expectations, or not our expectations, but what you can expect out of BaseCamp and from the various sessions that we'll offer. So with that, I think we'll call it a day. And I want to thank you again, Tom, and thank you again, Sara, for speaking today and giving us a little sort of sneak preview of BaseCamp. And for everyone who attended today, thank you very much. And I hope to see you on July 20th. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.